I think the spirit of the conversation or the the presentation, which is a pretty formal word for it, I would say, is just to talk a little bit about the transition from what I did for a long time, which is work in the record business for about 20 years as an A&R guy, into more of the archival and asset preservation and fan engagement kind of world, which is a relatively new endeavor for me, but I'm enjoying it immensely, and there's a tremendous kind of an emotional contact there that was waning with every elapsing nanosecond in the record business. So it's nice to be able to step away at this point in my life and concentrate on some stuff that I think is helps contextualize and promote and preserve legacies in a meaningful way, and use some of the skills and the background I had in the record business, particularly with artist contact and dealing with the creative community, to sort of inform the decisions and the applications of those skills in the archiving world.
And just so everyone can understand, the word A&R, what does that refer to and what does it entail?
A&R is the department in record companies and music publishing companies. It stands for Artists and Repertoire, which is really the point of contact between the artist and the manager and the producer and the creative community, and sort of what comes into the record company and then gets deployed into the public and consumed by the public. So it's the guys who are going out to gigs, signing bands, engaging producers, helping make records, shepherding the creative process along in the studio, and then when the record's finished, kind of being the internal cheerleader at the record company, so that the rest of the building kind of rallies around the album or the campaign or the artist, and makes it as successful as it can be.
And do you have any favorites among your 20 years in the A&R business that you've worked with that really either struck you, from the musical standpoint, emotionally, that really resonated with you, or?
Well, I've had, knock wood, the very good fortune of having worked with a pretty significant array of kind of iconic artists. I mean, from, there were artists actually at the beginning of their career and sort of at the tail end of their career, but the ones that had a particular emotional sort of resonance with me was, I worked with the Stones for a while. I'm a big Stones fan. Where I helped A&R a Brian Wilson record, so I was in the studio with Brian Wilson, which was kind of a surreal experience. There were a couple of developing things, Gnarls Barkley at the time, and Santa Gold, and Cold War Kids, and a band called White Denim when I was at Downtown Records that I either signed or had a pretty significant stake in. Mm-hmm. I worked with Neil Young. It was pretty surreal and awesome. Not that there's any A&Ring to do with Neil, but just kind of being in his orbit was cool. And then the last, sort of superstar I worked with was Prince at the tail end of his life, and that's kind of what. How I entered his orbit basically, and then stayed engaged after his passing and kind of doing what I'm doing now.
So now that you've mentioned Prince, can you elaborate a little bit more on your relationship with not only Prince the artist, but Prince as the person, and what your current role with the Prince estate is? Because I think that might be illuminating here.
Well, Prince, had a very deep and very successful relationship with Warner Brothers that started in late '77 is when he, I think, signed his first recording agreement, and then obviously all through the '80s and into the early part of the '90s, he's kind of was among the marquee artists on the label. So there was a lot of connective tissue there with him for a long time. Then there was a kind of a public falling out in the mid '90s, which I'm sure most of the people in this room might remember, where Prince wrote "Slave" on his cheek, and there was a kind of a he took the position of changing his name to an unpronounceable symbol so that he wasn't sort of beholden to the contractual obligations of the label. Then was kind of a very forward-thinking guy in basically carving his own path, being a DIY guy from minute one in the '90s all the way through basically early 2014 when he re-engaged with Warner Brothers. So right after I left Capitol to go to Warner Brothers, Prince had, sort of reconsummated his relationship, and that's when I became involved with him. So, it was, one of those things where basically, like Neil Young, there was not a lot of bona fide A&Ring to do. I mean, it's, you don't sit in the studio with a guy of that caliber and, direct the proceedings by any means. But I would get summoned to Paisley Park from time to time and, be as available and, offer as much perspective as I could, as sort of a conduit between him or his people or the people at Paisley Park and the label, and just try to be basically as, as good a facilitator as I could be. I was not tight with him. I don't want to overstate my importance, in the complexion of his creative life, which was essentially nil, but I did have some interaction with him, and he was, orders of magnitude more creatively evolved, I think, than any artist I had the pleasure of working with in my entire career. I mean, he was basically the exception to every rule, in a wonderful way. And with me, he was extremely engaged and humble and funny and not standoffish at all. I mean, he was awesome. I mean, it was really kind of surreal, sitting 2 feet away from Prince and just, kind of chatting with him. No handlers or bodyguards or other executives. It's, just the sheer star power kind of radiating off of the guy was pretty formidable.
And how did you have to adapt with your role when you dealt with Prince? Because you said he was the exception to the rule. What did you have to do to?
I think, because he he had such success and such facility in virtually anything that he did, and was, and was so, had so much clout, basically, I had to basically tamper a lot of the expectations on the record company side, because he was obviously a very strong personality and deserving of basically doing whatever he wanted to do at any time. So trying to translate his wishes sometimes to superimpose that on a corporation, was could lead to some nuanced conversations, shall we say, from time to time. But fortunately, Warner Brothers was at the time, and I think continues to be, a pretty artist-centric label. I mean, in the complexion of the major label world, it's certainly more artist-friendly, I think, than some of its competitors, or at least values the creative process in a way that seems to be less common now than it was, certainly when Prince was on the ascent at the beginning of his career.
Okay. And now, would you mind discussing your current role with Prince and your relationship and connection with Prince, the Prince estate, and the music? And
Sure. Well, I left Warner Brothers almost exactly a year ago, when I was actually sitting in this chair talking to Richard, who was sitting in your chair. I had just left Warner to become basically the chief archivist for the Prince estate. So there's a legendary vault. Prince has a vault of, material that is, exceptionally large and mostly unexploited for the most part, and incredibly rich. I mean, I cannot think really of a more, a deeper well of, culturally important but unheard or unseen material, unless, somebody stumbled across another Beatles vault. Or, I mean, it's hard to imagine that anything of this magnitude or caliber kind of exists. So I'm the guy who is very happily tasked with basically organizing, curating, digitizing, preserving, contextualizing the audiovisual elements in the vault. Now, I should say that I've had to sign a constellation of non-disclosure agreements, so I have to be somewhat. I have to observe those limitations.
Yes.
Not because I don't want to be candid or helpful, but because I have an obligation to the estate, of course. So I will answer whatever questions I can with as much specificity as I can, but there is a limit to what I can say and what I can't.
Got it.
But it has been an incredibly satisfying endeavor, since I decided, since I basically put my hand up to do it.
Said I'll be the guy.
Yeah, I said I'll be the guy, and I'm very, very happy to have stepped away from the sort of frontline record business to concentrate on, something that at this point in my career and life and evolution as a human has more emotional resonance with me than the complexion of the pop music marketplace, which I'm not dismissing as a pursuit itself. I'm just sort of the wrong guy, to be running after, highly reactive urban records.
Mm-hmm.
It's just not what I do best. And there are other people who are younger and more energetic and who know that world better than I do at this point. But being able to immerse myself in in this world has really been wonderfully satisfying.
So you made a good reference to the emotional connection to the music and how this is re-energized. And I think we're all at an audio show, and ostensibly many of us are here for the equipment, but ultimately we're here for the reproduction and the enjoyment of music.
Yeah.
How have you been able to work with this emotional reconnection or resonance with the music? What is it?
Well, in a number of different ways. I mean, one of the among the many missions with the sort of archival process, particularly as it relates to Prince, but presumably with artists of any any stripe, is to do it with as much completeness and respect and integrity as you can do, and to not only expose existing fans and super fans to the complexion of things that they might have never have heard or known existed, but also to pull new fans in. So people who might only know Prince by his name or by his biggest hits or through their parents or their grandparents or whatever, trying to make sure that they have an opportunity to explore some of his artistry, and using technology to do that is a major part. Whether it's social media or the streaming world or just things that weren't even contemplated when Prince was cranking out hits in the 80s. So
okay.
It's a brand new it's a brand new world, and it's accelerating with every day. So it's kind of exciting to see all of the opportunities there.
Good. Well, as you all know, we're here at an audio show, listening to equipment reproduce music. I know you are into the equipment, and just so
Yeah.
you know, Micheal introduced Parasound to Eric of Tecton because Micheal was using the Tecton speakers during his time at Warner Brothers in LA, and we made a nice connection there.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you can discuss a little bit, without getting too techy, about some of the archival processes
Yeah.
to preserve the fidelity of this great music in this vault,
Yeah.
and what your role is in that fidelity preservation.
Yeah, well, there are a couple of different elements. I mean, the first is to determine sort of what the best way forward is with a tremendous amount of material, thousands and thousands of recorded assets, audio, video, all kinds of stuff. So, trying to make sense of how to best move through that in a meaningful way is challenging in and of itself, because for the most part these as it relates to the Prince Vault, these things are not organized in what I would call a conventional way. So it takes a little bit of detective work and some forensic kind of science to determine whether what's written on the tape box is actually what's on the tape, or if it's incomplete or wrong, or not labeled at all, or if the tape needs to be baked, and there are all kinds of remediation questions that we have to ask ourselves. So there are a number of different elements to it, but we certainly the way I view it is I'm kind of a guy who's sitting as a museum curator would in a, in a room full of fine art and trying to, make sense of, who the painter was and when it was done. So for the most part, I try to move chronologically for two reasons. That's generally the path of least resistance, and also, for the most part, the oldest tapes are the ones in the most potential distress. So you want to get to those first, and not, try to kind of work your way forward. So that's, sort of the way we've approached the process. There are, a number of commercial considerations that enter the frame at any given time. So we, sort of pivot to accommodate those things when they emerge. But then we try to, return to the, the more academic, sort of pursuit of, moving from point A to point Z, with as much completeness as we can.
Okay, good.
So, there are 2-inch tapes, there are 1/4-inch and 1/2-inch stereo masters, there are cassettes, they're all, basically any format you can possibly imagine is in there. And, we're looking at, obviously, the oldest analog stuff first and kind of working our way forward as much as possible. So that's what we've been doing.
And I asked the question because I know a release just came out,
Yeah.
prints, and some of that was sourced from the original
It
cassettes,
was,
apparently.
yeah. That was
so.
It's called Piano and a Microphone,
Yes.
1983. And that recording had circulated among collectors and in the bootleg community for a number of years, almost 30 years, I think, since the late 80s, certainly since 91, so a long time, but in, kind of egregiously substandard audio. And, I always, I was aware of it and I was a fan of it just from a, a content standpoint. But one of the first things I wanted to do when I got into the vault was see if we could find the master, which I suspected was a cassette, just knowing what I did about the era and how it sounded.
Right.
And fortunately, we were able to sort of narrow the, candidate pool down to, I don't know, a dozen possibilities, I think. And we spotted on one of those, the TDK SA60 tape, I think was, the only, distinguishing characteristic was Prince's handwriting on side 2 that said Cold Coffee and Cocaine and Why the Butterflies, which are the 2 songs on side 2 of the tape. So when I saw that, I thought, it's probably it, and we would, put it in the machine, and fortunately it was the one. So among many thousands of cassettes, we were able to unearth that. But it was in remarkably good shape for, a 35-year-old cassette, that was not even in a plastic case. I mean, it was in a bag or something. I mean, it was, just kind of astonishing to think about. But, there was very little that we had to do to that. I mean, there was one, 15-second patch of flutter during Mary Don't You Weep, I think, and I had Bernie Grundman master it, and he tweaked it a little bit, but there was really no other digital manipulation of any kind. There was no edit, there was no crossfade, there was nothing. It was basically put the tape in, and what you hear on the record is the performance as it happened. Flip the tape, side A, flip the tape over, side B, and you're out. That's it. So it's pretty nice to be able to get that thing into the marketplace, and it seems to be generating more positive response than I even thought it would, which is very satisfying to see, obviously. So
good insight, thank you very much. That's good insight into that. So what, as Prince fans, or at least I am, and I assume many of you are, without giving away too much, what do we have to look forward to in the coming years, again, honoring your NDAs?
Yeah, well, there are a lot of things are being discussed, on a daily basis, and this is where it gets, into kind of a difficult area for me to be specific, but there is no shortage of studio stuff, live stuff, rehearsal material, things that probably even the most ardent expert fans are unaware that exist, things that are only rumored to exist that I, knew of in concept that we've come across. I mean, on a daily basis, we seem to find things that are, sort of wonderfully surprising. So, I think there's many, many years of, of potential, content in some way that will emerge. But it's not, I should also say that it's not as easy as just, spotting something and say, we love this, we're going to put it out. There are a lot of commercial partners and a lot of agreements we have to, honor. And obviously the family is very involved, and we are extremely respectful of, or try to be as respectful of their input and engagement as possible. And they were the people who knew him best, and we really want to honor his his memory and his legacy in the way that it demands. So it's a very deliberate, very considered process. It's not haphazard at all.
But we have things to look forward to.
Very,
is what
very
you're saying.
much, yes.
Good.
And I would say, to the point that I made earlier about not only for super fans, but I think that there are things that even casual, the casual 14-year-old pop listener who maybe is aware of Prince only by name will I hope fall in love with, because his influence is pretty significant even today. I mean, the guy was able to do virtually anything at the highest level. He was a guy who could kind of convincingly jump from genre to genre without really losing any audience, and do it with total authority, from kind of like bedroom, Quiet Storm bedroom R&B to salacious funk to full throttle arena rock to, sub, Return to Forever fusion to, it was like the guy was unbelievable. So, there's a lot in there that, sort of runs the gamut of styles and artistry.
And do you think, as consumers and music lovers, that we've seen these multitude of efforts that Prince, you mentioned a broad spectrum of musical styles, and again, without giving away too much, do you think we've, as a buying public, have seen only a small section of that, or do you think his existing material exhibits that breadth and depth?
I think he at least hinted at a lot of that stuff. I mean, keeping in mind that he was a guy really up until the very end who was extremely aware of the commercial marketplace and an avid consumer of music. So, I think he was mindful of the audience and what the audience reaction, would be. That said, he was a fickle guy, and very, he inclined to basically do whatever made him happy and whatever he thought would be the most honest representation of where he was creatively at any given time, and that extended to he was not a studio perfectionist at all. I mean, it was whatever he thought the most authentic kind of take, at any given time was. That was what became the master. It might not have been flawlessly executed. It might have had distortion. Like Little Red Corvette has tremendous amounts of distortion, vocal distortion in it. It became the master. There are different iterations of that. That's probably from a technical standpoint sound better, and any mastering engineer would go, "You got to use that one, not this one." But it's like, I'm using this one. So. He was a guy who had a very clear, crystal clear view of what he wanted to present.
Good.
Yeah.
Does anyone have any questions about the print? Oh, look at this. Okay, well, let's go with the young lady back there. Go ahead and speak up loudly so we can hear you.
Regarding the archive, can you share what the volume is of the digital audio part? Do you have an idea?
I can tell you it's enormous.
Petabytes?
Yeah, well, it will be. Not everything has been digitized, but it's a lot. I mean, it's a lot of material. I mean, there's tremendous amounts of analog and tremendous amounts of digital stuff, and the analog stuff is all being digitized. So, extrapolating that process, it will, possibly in the petabytes region, I would imagine, yes. Yeah, it's hundreds and hundreds of terabytes as it exists, yes.
And then your refresh plan for the older media, you're saying you're going from the oldest to newest.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that that's the way the commercial, the complexion of the commercial releases will look, but from an archival standpoint, we're trying to adhere to that. So we're, putting, 2-inch, we're analyzing 2-inch multi-track tapes. If they need to be baked, we bake them, we put them on the Studer, we run them off once at 24,192, and then we put them away, and we hope to never have to touch them again. We will if we need to, but that's what we have been doing so far. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think we have the gentleman over here. Thank you.
So my question is noise reduction, or all the tape hiss that you're having to handle, or even the different noise reduction algorithms that were used over the years.
Yeah.
How are you handling that? Are you using cedar, or what kind of stuff are you using?
Well, that's a good question. The exact chain, I don't know off the top of my head. I can ask one of the engineers. I'm not always the guy who's putting the tape on the machine and running it off. I'm sort of directing the proceedings, and there's a team of engineers who are doing it on a daily basis. I can give you my email address, and if you want the technical specifics of it, I can give those to you. But I can tell you that from if we were to release, re-release one of the original records, for example, this is conceptual. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but we would deliver theoretically the flat half-inch analog tape to Bernie, or a 24,192 run of the flat master, no noise reduction, no EQ of any other kind, just the basically as it is on the assembled pre-master reel to the mastering engineer, and that's how it would happen. So commercially, I think we're trying to be as close to the original concept or idea as possible, and not take into consideration the vagaries of the commercial marketplace. So if we have to mix something from an era that from 1982, for example, we would do it in a way that as best we can echoes what would have been happening in '82. So it's we'll go to Sunset Sound and we'll sit in Studio 3, and I'll use Susan Rogers or Peggy or David Rivkin or people who were there at the time and were part of the complexion of the whatever creative period Prince was in, and do it as authentically as possible. So, and which is sort of part of the, I hope, part of the guiding principle of the overall endeavor, which is to be as complete and respectful as possible, and that means wrapping your arm, at least in my estimation, wrapping your arms around as many people who were there at the time, who are around and want to be a part of the proceedings.
More good insight. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think Ramsey had a question.
Just from a general archiving standpoint,
Yeah.
I would think and I have a bit of a background in archiving, so you have the entire collection, which you want to save, you want to preserve it, and then, but it's almost too big, I would think, to do in a linear fashion.
It is.
When you guys are thinking about this, not just Prince, but just in general,
Yeah.
how these artists how their archives are used and
Yeah.
stuff like that. How much of it is like a commercial equation, and then how much of it is sort of like a historical?
That's a really good question.
Traditional archiving.
I mean, with
kind of
this company Inveniem that I'm working in tandem with, which is as I call it, a cultural archaeology company, right? So they sort of sit between white glove asset preservation, which is the archival process, and fan engagement, which is the commercial element, right? So, but they run the gamut of the entire business. So if a client, and it's not limited to music necessarily, but they will go in, or we will go in, theoretically, if I had time to do anything else but Prince, would go in to any repository, whether it's a vault or a storage space or a basement or a movie studio or a law office, it doesn't really matter, and excavate all of whatever needs to be preserved. So if it's analog tape or paperwork, photos, stage clothing, whatever it is. They'll analyze everything, they'll repair what needs to be repaired, they will take high resolution photographs of everything and put it on a contextual timeline. They will build, if the rights holders want, whether it's the estate or the lawyers or the artist, if the artist is still around, whether, if it's a fine artist or a musician, whoever it is, they will build commercial strategies around stuff. They do museum curation. They do philanthropic pursuits, if that's something that's in the line of sight of whoever it is. They'll do for asset authentication for auction purposes. They get into augmented reality and VR kinds of stuff. Very sophisticated endeavor. So that company is 5 years old, I think, and it was started by a guy in Boston, and has grown in sort of concentric circles outward. It's very, I mean, there's a lot of non-disclosure elements there as well, but he and his team have done a tremendous amount of work in a very short amount of time with, like household name, artists and organizations, and it's all been totally under the radar. I mean, it's, referrals basically. So, a manager calls somebody else and goes, these guys are great, you got to talk to them. And an estate gets involved in somebody else. So it's been, kind of a word of mouth thing. And I was watching what he was doing while I was at Warner, and he's such a lovely guy and is so good at what he does. I said, I should bring you in. The volume of the print stuff is such that I should, I'd love to bring you in to do the non-audiovisual stuff. So the handwritten lyrics and the photographs and the manuscripts and the illustrations and the stage clothing and the ephemera that Prince collected for 40 years, he and his team have done, and I'm doing the audiovisual stuff. We're kind of running in parallel to present the most holistic solution we can to the estate. So that's the long answer to your short question. So it's, so some, what I was getting, that's all a preamble to saying some clients only want the archiving, which is fine. They want to know what they have and, have it basically ready to deploy whenever the time is right, which is really, I mean, you really need to do, no matter what stage of your career I think you're in, it's probably good to have that done. So, so you're telling the narrative, sort of not leaving it up to somebody else to make that decision. So even guys who are, I mean, I can tell you that one of Inveniem's clients has only been a public figure for maybe 2 or 3 years. He has an enormous cultural footprint, but not not an enormous commercial timeline yet. But he's a guy who has kept everything basically, and he has a story. Everybody has a story, right? So he is interested in contextualizing that and doing, sort of traveling interactive exhibits when he's on tour and like really pretty interesting stuff. So that's what Inveniem does.
Yeah, it's just fascinating. I love that sort of archiving and then pushing the past into the future.
Yeah, exactly. That's
sort of a future
exactly the tagline of the company is your past is your future. That's exactly what it is. You're hired.
Can you say the name of the company one more time?
It's called Inveniem, Inveniem, which is a Latin word for you will find, I believe. Yeah. And there's no information online really about it. So, I mean, it's all very hush-hush, but it's legit. Yeah.
Now, you were talking about the name Bernie Grunman. Does that
Yes.
mean anything to folks out here? You mentioned Bernie Grunman, you mentioned some other names. Once you're working with this archival information, does that decision on which mastering engineer and producer, et cetera, rest under your direction, or how do you decide where to take this music to be mastered appropriately, et cetera?
Well, Prince always used Bernie. I mean, they had a very harmonious relationship. And Bernie, in my estimation, is among the very best in the biz. And his shop is like 3 blocks away from where the vault is, so it's easy to just go bring stuff over to him and hang with him.
Right.
But that yes, the decision not the decision, the suggestion for the most part is mine, and then kind of a small team of people say, for the most part, usually say yes, because there aren't many other choices that you would make when doing something from, in Prince's case anyway, a guy with whom he had a good relationship and who can do the work and do it the right way. So there is I'm kind of a de facto A&R-ing the stuff anyway. But usually, yes, when whoever is curating the specific project, doesn't have to be Prince necessarily, but whoever is kind of understands the complexion of it best, I think, is probably tasked with making those kinds of decisions, or at least making the suggestion and enumerating the reasons why it should be done.
Good. Are there any other questions relative to Michael's role as the chief archivist for the Prince estate before we move into a slightly different direction? Yes.
I have the vault
Yeah.
itself.
Yes.
Was that built when Paisley Park was built, or was this something before? And I heard a lot of different things, like it wasn't climate controlled. It was probably the worst place to put anything. Can you elaborate on that?
I can elaborate on it a little bit. I mean, the vault as a concept was started by Susan, or suggested by Susan Rogers in '85, middle of '85, I think, which preceded the existence of Paisley Park, the facility. So, it existed before then as basically a place where all of this recorded material was kept safely and theoretically in an organized fashion. When Paisley was built, it then became, the secure kind of vault that I think most people, imagine when they hear the word vault. I do not know all of the ins and outs of the condition of the interior of the vault, and I wouldn't want to speculate. I did hear that it was not commensurate with what you would want for this. And I think, knowing what I do now, I think it's certainly in the right place. It was moved from, and this is not secret, it's been in the news, it was moved from Paisley Park to a facility in Hollywood. So, and this place is, about as secure as you can get. It's, retrofitted with every natural disaster remediation, possibility you can think of. It's, we do everything in-house. We purpose-built rooms to do the transfers. We can mix in there. We can't master in there. We can do everything but master in there, really. So we don't have to take anything out. Nothing leaves the facility. So there, the security is about as airtight as you can get. And there's definitely no issues with respect to keeping the integrity or there's no injury is being added at this point to whatever the tapes have endured since they were recorded. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think they are in the right place at this point. Yes.
Good.
Hey, Michael. Thanks
Hi.
for coming. It's
Sure.
very interesting. I am aware that Prince worked a little bit, at least, with Miles Davis.
Yeah.
I've seen a little bit of video online, and I don't know if there's any official product that's been released, or if you can speak to anything about.
He certainly worked with Miles. He did the thing you have seen probably is a New Year's Eve performance that happened at
Right.
Paisley in '87. So it's New Year's Eve '87. There were, there were some other sessions that happened, from time to time. I don't know what is going to emerge. It has been discussed that some of that stuff might someday see the light of day, but they definitely did some work together, I can tell you that. And that performance, the New Year's Eve performance, I think is relatively available in the, kind of in the bootleg and collector
Yes, I've seen it for
world.
sale.
Yeah.
But it's not such. great
Yes, I've seen it
quality.
for sale too. I don't like that very much.
I didn't buy it.
That's all right.
Thank you.
That's totally fine. The bootleg, I have very mixed feelings about the bootleg market. I mean, it's great to see that the appetite is there, and I think, for the most part, people have been supporting the bootleg market only because they haven't had another option
Right.
until now.
Yeah.
This is, I'm trying to remedy that somewhat, which is a very, long and arduous process, or can be, because we don't move at the speed I think that the fans, for the most part, would like us to move. But it's not, as I said, lack of interest or, it's not posturing. It's just, it's just the reality of doing this, kind of the right way.
Sure, the physics of it all.
But I'm very aware of, what the perceived marketplace demand is, and the, all of the, kind of noise, the chatter that happens in the fan community about a lot of this stuff, and I pay attention to it for
Gotcha.
sure. I try not to let it get me depressed from time to time, but Yeah.
I didn't mean to make you upset.
No, 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 not at all.
I have another question. I don't know if you're going to answer it in this moment because it's about the Rolling Stones. And
Yes.
I'm just interested in the work you did with them and, what you could say about what recordings were released at the time you were involved.
Yeah, I was involved for not a very long time. I was at Virgin Records when the band was on Virgin. As with Prince and Neil Young, there's not A&Ring the Stones does not really exist. It was more of a, be available kind of thing when they need you. It was pretty awesome, to see that machinery, kind of what surrounded them in general. And, it was during the Bigger Bang era. So this is 2000, I don't know, 4 or 5, I guess. I can't remember exactly. It must have been 4. There was a tremendous amount of, they rolled pretty deep. I mean, it's not like I just showed up at the studio and they were hanging. But I do know I was friendly and still am friendly with Don Was, the producer who now runs Blue Note Records and is an incredible guy and a producer of the highest caliber and an excellent human being. So I had a bit of a relationship with him. I didn't have a lot of exposure directly to, one-on-one to the Stones, but it was certainly cool to, to be part of a relatively small team at that point, being on conference calls and making some decisions and going to the shows and, listening to rough mixes, just the things that as a 19-year-old, my head would have exploded had I known what I would be doing, 10 years, 15 years later, whatever it was. Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, Tyler.
Oh,
I'm waiting
you
for
wait
the
for the
mic
yeah.
here.
I should also say that enjoythemusic.com is very pleased that we are being sponsored by them today, so I wanted to mention that.
Good.
Before I move to the next question, sorry.
So it sounds like there's a significant amount of unreleased music, at least with the Prince estate. What sort of factors drive what content's going to be released next? Is it like input from fans or family, or are there like legal terms?
It's a little bit of everything. There are a number of things. I mean, there's certainly the perceived marketplace demand of a lot of these things. There are considerations to observe with respect to other projects that are happening. So, if we can release something that runs in parallel, for example, with another strategy, it would make sense to do that. I mean, we want to, sort of put our best foot forward in every way. There are existing agreements that have to be observed and adhered to so that, if we wanted to release something but it bumped into the rights, that were given to somebody else, that we can't just move forward, unilaterally without, sort of adhering to those things. There are record company considerations, I think, and what they think is, the way to sort of move forward. And certainly the family, whose voice is exceptionally important. So all of those things are, somewhat equally, weighted, I guess, in the, in when we're talking about how to best move forward or what's next on the agenda.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Are there any additional Prince questions before we slightly shift directions? We're good? What I'd like to do now, how many in the audience are consumers versus industry or manufacturers? Show of hands, who are consumers here? Terrific. We at audio shows, and I want to get back to the music in general, are often accused of playing the same old, tired, quote unquote, audiophile tracks. And I want to kind of expand that a little bit and ask you, given your years in the music business, where do you see where we are now in 2018 in terms of the creative juices that drive the music industry versus what you've seen in the past? Where are we? How do you look at where we are right now in terms of the creative juices that drive the music industry?
The creative juices on the
On the artist.
on the artist
On
side.
the
I
artist
see.
side, yes.
I think that it's, I'm kind of excited about certainly the possibilities of streaming, and what it has become, and the evolution I think that it has taken. Simply because the access obviously is so easy for virtually anybody. I mean, it introduces a subset of issues to my way of thinking that, for the most part, it seems like younger consumers don't really care about. Not the least of which is the experience itself, which I don't find very satisfying. Just sort of looking at a screen and kind of typing something up does not hit me in sort of a deep way. But my daughter, who is soon to be 13, is very agnostic about what she listens to. I mean, she loves Miles Davis. She likes Cardi B. She likes Prince. She likes the Stones. She will happily listen to Taylor Swift or Beethoven. And that is not something that, for the most part, the kids that I grew up with were, they were not that open to sort of exploring all of those different. Certainly at age 13, all of those different genres. I mean, in the case of me, I know I was kind of like, if it wasn't the Clash or Zeppelin or something, it was like not, it was, I dismissed it sort of outright.
Very focused.
Yeah. So it's I like seeing that there's an appetite and there's not pushback for the most part on something just because it seems to fall outside of the prescribed genre, that might bias you in another way. I am also encouraged actually by the amount of affordable gear that is exceptionally good, that has emerged over the last 10 years, maybe certainly 5 years, but over the last 10 years. And you guys and Eric and a few other companies kind of fall right in there, where you're getting, in my estimations, kind of world-class stuff at a pretty compelling price point. And it doesn't have to, you don't have to spend 80 grand, to get the sort of performance and the impact that that you used to have to do. I mean, it's just a much friendlier proposition for the most part. So for those reasons, I'm very encouraged, and I think that on the artist side, I think that there's a desire to. I think that there's at least in Nashville, as I've observed it, there's a real desire to sort of move away from the track-based, very kind of synthetic, emotionless record-making process, and really get into, doing as organic a job as you can, like, actually playing your instruments and sometimes recording to analog tape, and being concerned about how the vinyl might sound as opposed to the streaming product. And that to me is very, very encouraging when you have a 19-year-old who's interested in this sort of the discipline of learning how to play and how to read a chart and how to how the studio works, and is not not working in GarageBand all the time, which is not and that's wonderful too, having that technology. But at least the ability to move from world to world is a nice thing to see. So I think it's a pretty healthy time, certainly for people who are making the music, and it seems like people who are consuming it to me.
Well, so how do people find today's music in the audience here? Are you enjoying it? Do you find it off-putting? What's the general consensus with new music that's being put out today? Oh, we heard disappointing.
Should I turn on whatever the public radio station is, or college station? They're the ones that are playing stuff that's not.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then I have Shazam.
Yeah.
Too,
I get that.
because I've been in this industry for way longer than I care to talk about, but terrestrial radio is horrible.
Yeah, it's pretty bleak, I would say.
And even now, the satellite stations are starting to get to that point as well.
Mm-hmm.
Although there are some stations, if you dig deep enough, that play a lot of
Yeah.
cool stuff that you'll never hear over the airwaves. So,
Yeah, that's kind of a bummer because I think, one of the things I was saying about the, just being able to type up whatever
Yep.
you want. I mean, there's the lack of curation to some degree can be problematic because you got to know what you're looking for. It's like, well, I don't know, I'm just going to type in what I know, but you're
Right.
not being led somewhere without, somebody knowledgeable sort of leading the way. And so for the most part, terrestrial radio isn't doing that. I'm listening to satellite radio that much, but I do get the impression that doesn't happen. I mean, maybe it happens more on satellite radio, but maybe, deep tracks and maybe the jazz stations and XMU or whatever, but, I would imagine that the vast majority of them are not that dissimilar from terrestrial radio, which is not really a place to discover music at this point, with some exceptions, I would say.
I think it.
We
sorry.
have one.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I do find music when I'm searching title, like I'll find a genre and just kind of scroll through and, see what's there. So
Yeah.
that's how I find music also.
Well, that's good to know.
Is that is that how you explore and are introduced to new music?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Well, that is good.
But something that I've been thinking about is where are the next big bands? So are we ever going to have bands that had the influence of the Beatles or the Stones or Prince, or it just feels like those sort of iconic, those they were big 30 years ago and they're just as big now. Paul McCartney, right? Like they're still the biggest artist in a way.
Yeah, I don't. It's difficult to say. I mean, I don't have a gut feeling that that anybody who could be a contender in that world has really raised their hand in the way that it will happen. I mean, I find it's difficult to find like a convincing rock band for the most part to me at this point. I mean, there are some exceptions, but I think the rock, certainly the rock consumer market is not what it was, and it's, I think, difficult to imagine that it would get back to to that point. I hope I'm wrong. I mean, it doesn't it doesn't. I don't feel that there's that much innovation happening certainly in the rock world. There's more perhaps in Americana or the fringes of hip hop or world music of some kind, and maybe maybe that will become whatever rock was in the mid 70s through the mid 90s. But I don't see, just looking at the landscape of bands at this point, it doesn't look like there are many of them that will happen.
Good
I
question.
sound like an
Thank you.
old fart, but which I am. By the way. Yeah.
Michael, I just have two comments. My opinion is it's better than ever, because as this discussion, when I was a teenager, if I wanted to experience music, I had to go to the record store.
Yeah.
And there was a 98% chance I couldn't listen to it. I don't know how much music I purchased that I got back home on vinyl, by the way. I couldn't fast forward it. It didn't flip itself over. I couldn't touch a button and get to a new track. So things, in my opinion, things are better than ever, because I have access through Tidal and iTunes and everything else, access to, I'm guessing, literally millions and millions of tracks.
Yeah.
And I don't have to leave my seat, and I can buy it that fast.
Yeah.
So
That is awesome. I agree.
It's the best it's ever been.
Yeah.
Now, just my opinion, and maybe I'm a musician, I'm an audiophile, and then I love working with people like you because I want to be in the music industry myself. So on the outside looking in, I'll tell you an experience I had last year, and I'd love to get your feedback on this. So in preparation for this show a year ago, I thought, it'll be fun. I've got an evening here. I went to iTunes, I played the top 50. Listened to, brief moments of all top 50 current tracks. There were 4 of them that I felt that I could bring to this show and actually demonstrate what we do with our electronics that I thought were audiophile compatible tracks. And to me, that's just my opinion. It's sad commentary. You know, I'd love to be playing. Well, let me add a little bit more. Jerry Del Caliano, Home Theater Review, the owner of Home Theater Review. He's like, Eric, when you do these shows, and this is flying in the face of everything that's sacred and holy in this building, when you do these shows, only play platinum and Grammy-winning people. And I say, hey, you know what? I think that's a great idea. And you know what? Honestly, I try to do that. But I've lost my train of thought here. Anyway, I'd just love to get a few of your thoughts, because I think that as audiophiles and in the music world. So anyway, back to the Maroon 5. You know what? They got great music. I can't demo it. I'd love to demo it. But
Just because it's so compressed and so.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yep. And it's just sad commentary. So anyway, enough said.
Yeah, 3 minutes, okay. Yeah, I agree. I mean, for the most part, pop music is not, is not very satisfying, on a sonic level to me. But I think, that's just the unfortunate. Yeah.
Would it be fair to say that?
I think there's been times and there's been artists and we play them here and we've all heard them 1,000 times. So it's not in an entirety. There are certain artists that we really connect with, and then there's other ones that it's like, yeah, no, we'll never play their stuff. So anyway.
Yeah, I agree. Agreed. Anybody else before we run the clock out here?
I would like, yes, one last question, and then
talking about, when you brought up when's the next big rock band going to happen. I think the kind of work you're doing with archival, with musicians, as I am as well, it's all about inspiration. Where did Prince get his inspiration from? A lot of the greats. And the people today have never heard most of that.
Yeah.
And so by making it available, they'll start to tune in and realize the genius that was happening way before their time. And I think you'll start to see that come back around.
I hope so. Yeah.
I think you will.
That's a good point. That's a very good point.
before we close, I'd like the consumers in the audience. We've got Eric here from Tecton in room 3004. Stop by and say hi to Eric. I'm hosting the Parasound room in 6032. Please come up and see us. We'll play music for you, and I'd like to give a round of applause for Micheal for flying in and chatting with us for a little bit. So thank you, Micheal.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.